So what if every time you read some text, whether on a screen or in a good old-fashioned book, it reminded you of how to be a better dungeon master? With the exception of maybe a handful of languages, nearly all written languages have punctuation in common. So, hi, my name is Robert Peak, I'm the Spontaneous Dungeon Master, and in this video, I want to show you how I use 7 different types of punctuation: the ampersand, the comma, the question, the exclamation point, the semicolon, the quote mark, and the period, to remind me of some of my favorite principles about how to be a good dungeon master. Okay, so let's start with probably what is the most iconic and possibly the most important symbol, the ampersand. It's what joins the dungeon to the dragon. And what it says is you can have both. Not just dungeons, not just dragons, but dungeons with dragons and dragons with dungeons. So what the ampersand really does and reminds me of is a key principle in improv, which is the yes and principle. Now, this can be overused, and it has become a bit of maybe something that has been misunderstood or made a bit trite in certain circles and certain lines of thought about dungeon mastering. But the fundamental principle is really strong and really useful. And that is that the word no shuts stuff down. Is there an exit from this dungeon, or possibly, something that I could find that will give me a way out? No. No, you're stuck. That's it. The end, right? You might as well just jam a dagger through the heart of the player's agency at that point, as well as all of their options. Now, sometimes the answer is no, and we'll talk about how to deal with that. But generally speaking, if there's some way to say yes, you have an opportunity to further the adventure. So to me, the ampersand is probably the single biggest reminder. Every time I see it, I think Dungeons & Dragons is about being open to new possibility. Dungeons & Dragons is about creating possibility as a dungeon master for my players, to give them opportunities to make choices, and then, of course, to reap the consequences of those choices. Is there some snow on a low-lying ledge I can make a snowball to throw at the guard? Absolutely. It's winter. Makes sense. Knock yourself out, and let's see what happens. The ampersand, far and away, one of my favorite reminders of one of, I think, the most important principles, the yes and principle. Next up, the comma, right behind it. The comma joins stuff together, and it's a great foil or counterpoint to the ampersand, in that in the comma you can get the phrase no, comma, but. No, comma, however. Right? No, there's no visible exit. However, it looks like you could be able to scale that wall and hide in a corner. There's no visible exit, but there's some debris lying around that you might want to rifle through to see. There's no visible exit, but remember, you have that spell that allows you, to dimension door away into a different place, or whatever. Right? So you're collaborating with your players. You're making it realistic. You're being true to the world in terms of the physics and the principles of magic and whatever it is that governs the land, as well as the rules that govern the game. But you're putting in a but. You're putting in a however. So if the answer really is no, putting a little comma on there, making it a no but, can go a long way toward, again, keeping it open. Keeping it yourself available to the possibilities that your players can change what you thought was the game in some far more fun and interesting ways than what you had planned. Third up, the question mark. This is one I think that a lot of new DMs in particular miss, which is that you can just ask your players. I was talking to a young DM the other day who was saying, how do I create plot hooks that they really want to engage with? And my answer was, ask them. Ask them what they want. Ask them what's going to engage them. Ask them what they're interested in. Ask them what's going to grab their attention and make them want to run with that kind of adventure. I did a whole other video about surveys and how you can use surveys to ask lots of questions of your players. But even in game, it's a great thing to do, to say, well, what are you trying to achieve here? Or what are you thinking about this? To give them more options and more possibilities, especially newer players who may only think that, their only choice is to attack or run or whatever, to say, what would you like to do? What are you trying to accomplish? Let's try this kind of skill check for that. Let's, there's some options over here of how you could potentially do that. Collaborating with your players by asking good questions. Next up, the exclamation point. Remember that a good DM always has the element of surprise on her or his side. Keeping that element of surprise, being able to introduce something that players go, wow, I wasn't expecting that. And in particular, starting with something surprising or interesting, starting with a bang, as it were. Starting with an exclamation even, such as, Everybody roll for initiative. Fantastic way to begin an adventure. So always keep the element of surprise with you. Always, know that you have that opportunity to throw something in that's highly unexpected. And ideally, start with a bang. Start with an exclamation of some kind. Get everyone off their phones, fully focused on you and ready to play. Next one up, the semicolon. The semicolon is a great one for kind of doing sort of two sentences in parallel that are related but not, right? It kind of joins up two things that aren't quite joined by a comma but aren't quite totally separated by a period or a full stop. And here, one of the principles I love is being able to jump between parallel activity or parallel kind of scenes. So very often, splitting the party can be a ton of fun. Maybe not so much down a really dangerous dungeon, but in a city or all kinds of other places. It can be really great to create tension by switching over to camera one and, okay, you guys are in this part of the city doing something, and then something interesting starts to happen. Okay, let's switch back to camera two, right? So it's a kind of mini cliffhanger that can happen all throughout the adventure. And it's just great to have things running in parallel. It gives you more of that sense that there's a whole rich world thriving out here rather than just the linear sequence of what one group experiences from A to B to C. Next up, the quotation mark. Quotation mark reminds me that dialogue can be very, very powerful. So narrating what your character can do is great, but asking, what do you say? Give me what it would sound like for the player to ask that, or to do that intimidation, or to try that persuasion. Can be a great way to draw particularly new players out a little bit, get them to do a little bit of role playing. And of course, always as a DM, you want to lead by example. Put on the silly voices. Have the goblin, shouting, "Blark, blark," as they come racing through. So D&D is a funny mix of dialogue, which you see traditionally in improv and acting, and narration, and knowing when to switch into the quote marks, right? And when to switch into that mode where you're talking in character as an NPC to them, can be incredibly powerful. Finally, the period, the full stop. And you would think, between the ampersand and the comma, you just always want to keep things flowing and going and open and continue on with the story and the adventure. But the period reminds me, you got to know when to stop. You got to know when it's time to cut for the day, for the session, or when it's time to stop with some, particular plot arc or some particular, part of the story or some particular through line or thread that's going on in the campaign. You even need to know when to stop the campaign itself, right? Having things just kind of die out is a lot less fun than saying, right, I think right here, my instincts are telling me we're done with this. Let's move on for sake of contrast, for sake of variety. Let's start a new campaign, or let's get them, out of this location and into a whole different type of experience. We've done a lot of dungeons. Let's do some social interactions. We've done a lot of that. Let's explore some wilderness, right? So knowing when to put a full stop to that sentence, put a period there. And move on to something else for sake of contrast or for sake of drama. One of the things I love, and I may talk about a bit, is ending a session with a cliffhanger. Fantastic way to make sure that the players are just thinking about what's going to happen next all week long. And a lot of the fun of D&D actually comes to me, and even outside of the session, thinking about what's going to happen and having it influence your life in a positive way. So hopefully this is helpful to you. Again, the ampersand, which is about the yes and, the comma, which is about the kind of the no but, the question mark, which is, look, you can ask your players, like, solicit information about what kind of game they want to play, and then serve that up to them. The exclamation, reminding you to keep the element of surprise always on your side. The semicolon, which is about having things happen in parallel, related, but kind of separate. The quote mark, which reminds me that dialogue is incredibly powerful, both encouraging it and modeling it. And finally, the period. Know when to stop. Know when that's run its course and it's time to move on to something else. So as I'm reading text, I come across these things, and in particular, every time I see the D&D logo, right, I look at that ampersand and I think, yes, it's about possibility. Yes, it's about the ampersand that joins things together that makes a great story. Hopefully this will be in your mind, swimming around as well the next time you encounter one of these punctuation marks. And hopefully this was a useful little kind of mnemonic, basically, for remembering what I find to be some of the principles that make my games the most fun.